thank you everyone for calling in with us today, and hopefully this will be an informative presentation about our upcoming NVMe Plugfest. Just to give you a quick overview of what we're going to talk about, I'm going to start with a very brief introduction of UNH-IOL, and then a quick overview of the NVMe Integrators List program. And I'm going to move through those six sections relatively quickly. I'm sure many of the callers are familiar with both UNH-IOL and the NVMe Integrators List program. So I'll cover those quickly and then move into some things that are specific to and pertinent to our third NVMe Plugfest that's coming up this November. So first off, about UNH-IOL, a little bit about why we're involved and what we do. Why are we the ones hosting the Plugfest and hosting this webinar? For those of you who aren't familiar with us, UNH-IOL is a third-party independent test facility. We're based here at the University of New Hampshire, and we specialize in a number of different data communications technologies. So on the storage side, SAS, SATA, fiber channel, iSCSI, and now more recently, NVMe. You may also have worked with us on the networking side, various flavors of Ethernet, IPv6, bridging protocols, and the like. The interesting thing about our lab, we're 100% funded by the industry, and that's why we work so closely with organizations like the NVMe Express NVM Express organization in order to really kind of have our finger on the pulse of what's happening in each of those industries. We're located here in New Hampshire, about an hour and a half north of Boston, Massachusetts, USA. An incomplete list here of the companies that we're currently involved with. You may see your company's logo in there, but just gives you an idea of the scope of companies that we work directly with. Now we do work, as I mentioned, directly with the NVM Express organization, and this is really a community effort that we've partnered with NVM Express organization to create a consortium around specifically testing NVMe. And just like you can be a member of the NVM Express organization, you can become a member of the NVMe Testing Consortium here at UNH-IOL, and there's some benefits that go along with that. First and foremost, and one that's important for what we're talking about today, is attendance and participation in the NVMe Plugfest. Also, test tools that we provide to help people do this testing in their own lab in preparation for the Plugfest. The ability to list products on the NVMe Integrators list, that may be something that's of interest to those of you on the call today. And then also support for UNH's administration of some open source NVMe tools. You may have used the tNVMe tool that's currently administered by UNH-IOL. So those are some of the benefits that come from working with the NVMe Consortium here at UNH-IOL. In order to complement what we're doing for NVMe, we also offer PCI Express electrical testing. So that's something that's, again, going to be covered at this upcoming Plugfest, but if you've got further questions on that, you can contact me directly. So now, moving into some more specific information about the Plugfest, I've got a picture here of our Plugfest room. And essentially what you see here is it's a big room with a bunch of workstations. We've got power and network to each station. And so what's going to happen at the Plugfest is that each attending company is going to come in. They're going to have their own station to set up their equipment and work for the week. And the fact that we're in a large open room kind of denotes one of the key qualities we like to have with our events, and that's open cooperative collaboration. So again, because we're working with the NVM Express organization, we really view this as an event to benefit the whole NVMe ecosystem. So we want there to be an open and collaborative environment. And so we think that this facility allows us the best opportunity to do that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the test program itself. This is not necessarily new information, but I do want to provide an overview of that. A little bit of information about the interop and conformance components within the Plugfest. We will be doing both types of testing. some of the logistics about what to expect and who should be attending and how to register for the Plugfest if you haven't done so already. A little bit about the reporting that's going to come out of the event, and then how to list products, and then testing that can occur after the Plugfest. Maybe you're coming into the webinar to find out how you can get more involved in NVMe testing, but you might not be able to attend the Plugfest. We'll have a little bit of information for you folks about what kind of testing is going to happen after the Plugfest if you're still interested in getting a product on the integrators list but might not be ready for the Plugfest. So first, just about the NVMe program itself. Obviously, there's been a lot of interest, and the NVMe market continues to grow. I really enjoyed this statistics from Forbes from this summer that by 2016, the SSD market for enterprise, and that's where a lot of interest in NVMe is at the moment, will be 6 times what it was in 2011. So clearly a lot of interest there. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the growth and excitement that's surrounding NVMe. And we really believe that being able to publicly demonstrate the interoperability and the viability of NVMe is extremely important for the continued growth of this ecosystem. And this Plugfest is an important part of that. It's a chance for companies to come together and show that as a specification, as a technology, the NVMe is strong, it's robust, and it's interoperable. So we really want our Plugfest and our interoperability program to enable that. And because of that, as I mentioned earlier, we work very closely with the NVM Express organization, in fact, since 2012. Now, I've been talking about the NVMe integrators list. It's a little screenshot of the NVMe integrators list from earlier this week. And what you see here is a public list. It's out there. Anybody can go look at it. And it tells you what products have gone through this program earlier. Now, you notice on this screenshot here, we've got the NVMe integrators list for the 1.1 program. That was one that we started back in February of this year. It was launched with our second Plugfest and continued throughout this summer, and in fact continues until this point. And we've also got the 1.1b list. That's the list that's going to be launched at this upcoming Plugfest. And the requirements between 1.1 and 1.1b are a little bit different. There's been some tweaking there, and I'll get to explain that during today's call. But if you're looking for the integrators list and you want to see what products are already on there, I've got the link there at the bottom. So we really want this list to be a resource for the industry, a place where they can look to see what products have met an industry-accepted metric for interoperability and conformance. And this is becoming even more and more important because there are OEMs that are looking at this integrators list and looking at the testing that goes along with it, the testing that's performed in order to qualify a product for this integrators list. And they're really looking at that as a must-have, a requirement for devices that they're going to be putting into their systems. So we're really starting to see the stature and the importance of this list continue to grow. Again, the goals of the program aren't a surprise. We want to ensure we've got high-quality products, high-quality ecosystem, help people going through this testing to demonstrate that their products are conformant and interoperable, and also provide some recognition for products that do meet the necessary requirements by allowing them to list on this integrators list and also providing them a third-party independent report from UNH-IOL. Now, you might wonder, where do these tests come from? Who decides what they are? And really what happens is that the NVMe Express organization will discuss what kind of features are going to be important for the next round of products. What kind of features in the specification are the ones that we really want to test? I'll take that, UNH-IOL will take that, and design some tests that actually exercise those features, that check those features. We'll report back to the NVM Express organization, and they'll kind of give the thumbs up or thumbs down, and we'll have some back and forth on what exactly these tests are going to do and how exactly they're going to work. So that's how that process works. When we have new tests or when we have new features that are in the specification, that's when we have a Plugfest. So the Plugfest is really the first opportunity for folks to test any new features in the specifications or perhaps a new set of requirements for the integrators list. Now, even though the Plugfest only happens, it'll be twice in 2014. We'll see how many we have in 2015. It's just a week long. It's 1 or 2 times a year. And so we want to make sure that even when that Plugfest is over, people can continue to test their products and continue to list products on the integrators list. And so the lab here at UNH-IOL remains open throughout the year, and we continue to have those tests available. So even if a product isn't ready for the Plugfest, maybe it's ready a few weeks or months later, that product can be sent into UNH-IOL for testing and still be listed on the integrators list. So now I'll get into some of the things that are a little more specific for this upcoming event. You're hopefully already familiar with the date, November 10th through 13th this year here at UNH-IOL. And this is going to be done to version 1.1b of the NVMe specification, and that's also the same naming that we've applied to the NVMe test program. At the event, we're going to do 2 different sets of tests, a set of interoperability tests and a set of conformance tests. And both of these have been published on the UNH-IOL website. They're available now. You can go and download those test plans and review them for yourself. And I'll have links to those later in today's presentation. Now, before I get into some of the details about the tests, I want to just clarify some terms I'm going to use to describe the testing. And there's 3 terms you're going to see sprinkled throughout this presentation: mandatory, optional, and FYI. And I want to make clear what the meaning for those things are. When we talk about mandatory tests, these are things that are required by the NVMe specification when it comes to conformance, or required by the Interoperability Test Suite when it comes to interoperability testing. A device must pass those mandatory tests and must pass all of those mandatory tests in order to qualify for the integrators list. We also have optional tests. Now, these are tests where there may be a feature that's described in the NVMe specification as optional. Some devices may support it, some devices don't support it. If a device supports that optional feature, it has to pass that test. If you implement this feature, you must implement it correctly. That's what we're checking with those optional tests. If a device doesn't support that optional feature, it just doesn't have that feature turned on or hasn't been implemented yet, the test is simply not applicable and it has no effect on whether a device qualifies for the integrators list or not. So that's how we use that term optional. It's an option in the spec, and the device may or may not have implemented that option. And depending on what they've implemented, certain tests may become applicable or not applicable. And then finally, we have FYI tests, or for your information. You might remember seeing that term bounced around if you've gone to any PCIe SIG events. And the purpose of the FYI test, this is a test that doesn't affect integrators list qualification today, but it may become a requirement for integrators qualification or integrators list qualification in the future. And we've got a couple interoperability tests that at this event are FYI, but at our next event, probably later in 2015, will be required tests. So we want to pay special attention to those. They don't affect integrators list qualification today. They don't affect integrators list qualification coming out of this Plugfest number 3, but they will be required in the future. So you want to pay attention to those. So, as I said, the conformance tests, we expect that you pass all mandatory conformance tests that are supported by our test rules in order to get on the integrators list. For the Interop tests, and this is something I mentioned earlier, these are some things that are going to change between Plugfest number 3, which is the one we're coming into right now, and Plugfest number 4. Today, for the Interop tests, we expect that a device passes all the mandatory tests with 4 out of 5 host systems. So we're going to test each SSD against 5 different host systems and different operating systems, and we expect that you pass the mandatory tests with at least 4 of those systems. As I said, the FYI tests don't affect the integrators list qualification, and we're only going to perform those with 1 system. So we're not going to perform the FYI tests with 5 different systems. We're only going to perform them with 1 system. And you can kind of think of that as, kind of putting you on alert for the next event and for the next round of the NVMe test program, that those tests, those FYI tests, are going to be required. Now, when we look ahead to Plugfest number 4, and again, like I said, that's not going to be until 2015, there's going to be 2 important changes to pay attention to. One, we're going to increase the number of systems that you have to test with. So today it's 4 out of 5, pass with 4 out of 5 systems. At the future events, it's going to be passed with 5 out of 6. So we're going to kind of raise that bar a little bit for interoperability testing. Also, the FYI tests will become mandatory, and I'm going to get into a little bit about which tests those are. So the mandatory tests, and I've got a brief description of them here. If you review the interoperability test suite, the mandatory tests are tests 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, and 1.4. And essentially what those tests do is have you install an SSD in a system, make sure that the operating system can identify it as a storage device, that it can format the storage device, and then we do a write, read, and verify test. We run that for 3 minutes, then we reboot the system. We repeat that 3 times. Then we do the write, read, verify test and shut down the system, bring it back up, and repeat that process 3 times. That's a brief description of what the mandatory interoperability tests are going to be. The FYI tests, those are tests 1.5 and 1.6 from the interoperability test suite. There is booting from an NVMe device. So we actually have a procedure where we're going to use the SSD under test and load an operating system onto it and boot a server up off of the NVMe device. That procedure is described in some pretty extensive detail in the interoperability test suite. We're going to be performing that test again as an FYI test at this event. And then test 1.6 is the hot plug test. Now this particular test only applies to devices that are using the SFF8639 form factor, or that 2.5-inch drive form factor. So this is a test where we're going to have the drives plugged into a system, and we're going to do an orderly removal and then an orderly reinstall or orderly reinsertion of a drive in the system. Again, that's an FYI test this time. Doesn't affect integrators list qualification, but it will be a requirement next time. So if you want to review in detail the procedures for each of these tests, and I recommend that you do, you'll see the link here at the bottom of this page where you can find those test suite documents and see those procedures in a little more detail. Now for those mandatory tests, the write, read, and verify tests, those are numbers 1.1 through 1.4. The tool that we use for performing those is VDBench, and you may be familiar with that tool. Originally created by Oracle. It's an open source tool. And the reason we chose VDBench was that it was easy to use on both Windows and Linux systems. So here I've provided the link for you to download VDBench directly from oracle.com. And I've also provided the link here for the parameter files that UNH-IOL has created for performing these tests. So if you have downloaded VDBench, you've got that up and running on your system. They've got some really great documentation to help you get that up and running. You can then go to these links at the bottom of this page and download the parameter files. And you'll see there's one for Linux and one for Windows. Obviously, you'll download the one that pertains to the operating system that you're using. And when you run those parameter files using VDBench, you're going to be executing essentially exactly the tests that we'll be doing at the Plugfest. So that's a nice exercise to go through to help get you prepared and get an idea of what's involved in actually doing those tests. So we try and provide those resources to you ahead of time so everybody's familiar with how that test is going to work. Now one thing that we're seeing more of course, is devices using the SFF8639 form factor, that 2.5-inch drive form factor. Now I've got a few host platforms that also use that form factor, you know, for front-loading these types of drives, but not all of the host systems have that form factor available yet. So in order to do some of the interoperability testing, we're going to need to use some adapters. So I've got here a photo of an adapter. This is a SFF8639 to PCIe Chem adapter. And you can see in the picture, basically, you can plug in the drive on the top, and then this card will plug into any kind of standard PCIe Chem system. I'm going to have a handful of these here at UNH-IOL for people to use and to help facilitate this testing. However, I really advise you that if you're bringing a device that implements that SFF8639 form factor, to bring some of these adapters with you. It'll just really make things a lot smoother and really facilitate the testing And it'll eliminate any possibility that we run out of adapters and then we have tests delayed because we don't have adapters and things like that. So you can get those adapters, or if you have your own, that's fine, bring those. I just provide some information here about the one that I have in my lab from serial cables. So pay attention to that. M.2 adapters, if you do happen to have an M.2 device. I don't have any M.2 adapters in my lab at the moment. So again, same principle applies. If you have an M.2 device, please bring an adapter so that we can easily plug it into a regular chem or add-in card system. Another thing to be aware of for these interoperability tests, it's really good to bring 2 samples of product. And the reason I say that is some of the interoperability tests actually involve having 2 NVMe devices plugged into the host system and verifying that having 2 devices in there doesn't cause any problems and that they're interoperable. So again, this is another thing that you can do to kind of make that testing go a little bit smoother, is to have 2 samples, because some of those samples will actually be used in a single test simultaneously. They don't have to be identical samples. If you have, let's say you've got one sample that's one capacity and then you've got another sample that's a different capacity SSD. That's fine. Or you may have even different controllers on them or perhaps different firmware. That's fine too. We're just going to identify one of them, however, as having the test done. So please try and bring 2 samples of your product. If they're not identical, that's okay. Again, if you've got questions about that, you can contact us directly or we'll address it at the end of the program today. Now, I talked a little bit earlier about what tests were required, what were mandatory, and I tried to consolidate that all into this table here. So these are the 7 interoperability tests that have been defined. You'll see at the one at the bottom, the dual port device is not an implemented test. We will not be performing that at the event, although you will see it described in the test suite document. We'll not be performing that test. It doesn't have any effect on integrators list qualification. You'll see those 4 tests with the green dots under mandatory. We're going to perform those on every single device. Look for those to pass with 4 out of 5 hosts. And then 1.5 and 1.6, the boot and hot plug tests, those are optional. They will be mandatory for Plugfest number 4. And you'll see the boot test we're going to be performing with a Dell PowerEdge R720 server. Pretty common server, still available in the market if you wanted to do some experiments yourself in your own lab. And then we'll have another host set up for hot plug. Still trying to collect the information about exactly which hardware we're going to use for that. But that will be something that we post on our fact page, our Plugfest FAQ, when we have the exact information about which host we're going to use for the hot plug test. And here's another table describing exactly which hardware and operating systems we're going to have set up here at UNH-IOL for each of these tests. So on the left, we've got a description of the hardware platform. On the middle, which operating system we're going to have running on that hardware platform. And then on the right, which tests we intend to use it for. So you'll see we've got 5 systems set up, each with a different operating system that we're going to use for the write, read, and verify tests. And then 1 system for the hot plug test, 1 system for the boot test. And this is going to carry over to the following Plugfest. We'll have 6 systems at the following Plugfest set up for the write, read, and verify tests, but we'll still only have 1 system set up for hot plug and 1 system set up for boot. So that covers the interoperability testing. I'm going to move now into the conformance testing, the other type of testing we'll be doing at this event. And basically what the conformance testing involves is we use a test tool, a test generator, to act as a host, to act as an NVMe host, and exercise and stimulate the SSD that we're testing. And again, you can go to our test suites page and actually download that conformance test plan and look at it in some detail, understand what those tests involve. And we use 2 different tools to perform these tests. And there is some overlap in what these tools are able to do, so I'm going to discuss that a little bit. Again, you may be familiar with these tools if you've attended past events or been involved in UNH-IOL for a while. We have the IOL INTERACT PC tool and the IOL INTERACT Teledynelecroy tool. I'm going to describe a little bit about how these work and what their various strengths are. So first, the IOL INTERACT PC edition. This is a tool that essentially you can take any Ubuntu PC that has an Intel PCIe chipset in it and turn it into an NVMe test system. The tests and the software that we use for IOL INTERACT and that we've developed for IOL INTERACT is based on TNVMe. So again, TNVMe is an open source project. You can go out to GitHub and get that, and you can even use it to develop some of your own tools if that's something that interests you. But that TNVMe tool is maintained by UNH-IOL for the benefit of the NVMe community, and we've used it in implementing this IOL INTERACT tool. And like I said, you can install that IOL INTERACT tool on any system that has an Intel PCIe chipset and runs Ubuntu. And I've got a few of the versions of Ubuntu that we've done extensive testing with on it. I've got a walkthrough here that'll show you how to actually install it if you're interested in doing that. And this IOL INTERACT tool is something that's available to all members of the UNH-IOL NVMe Consortium. And if you're interested in using that tool, you can contact us directly. There's an email address there at the bottom. There's also the Teledynelecroy tool. Now, this one, instead of taking a regular PC, takes a bus analyzer and exerciser from Teledynelecroy and uses that as our utility for generating traffic and stimulating the SSD. Right now, this is an important point. Our software works with the Lecroy software 6.75, but we're looking to bump that up to Lecroy software version 7.2 by the time of the Plugfest. So Lecroy's released newer versions of that software, and we're playing a little bit of catch up with that. But we're hoping to have our software working smoothly with their 7.2 software by the time of the Plugfest. Again, this tool is available through membership in the UNH-IOL NVMe Consortium. Now, a question that we get a lot when we talk about these two different tools is, well, why do you have two different tools? And the fact is, both of them have their own benefits. First, as far as having a tool with a relatively low cost barrier, the PC edition meets that because the hardware requirements for it are pretty low. You just need, essentially, you just need a PC. And you can turn that into an NVMe test system. But that tool doesn't have, the PC edition tool, while easier to set up and easier to obtain in a sense, it doesn't have the same ability to capture bus traces and analyze PCIe traffic as the Teledynelecroy tool does. Now obviously for using the Teledynelecroy tool you need to have that hardware, and there's some cost involved in doing that, but there's more capability that goes along with that. So really there's a trade-off between these two tools, the cost of setting up the system, the cost of the hardware, and your debug capability and trace analysis. So that's why we've introduced both to help people that are maybe just getting involved, don't have this kind of debug bus analysis hardware available yet. They can use the PC edition tool and get a good idea of whether or not they're meeting the integrators list qualification or not. And then for those folks who are further along and do have access to this type of equipment, they can actually use the Teledynelecroy version, get all those bus traces and do their own kind of analysis and debug with that, take advantage of all that capability. And this is an important point. If there's a disagreement between these tools, we've done everything we can within UNH-IOL and testing and trying to do correlation between these two tools. And we're pretty happy with the correlation that we've gotten. But if there is a disagreement, if we're getting one result out of one tool that says it's a pass and one result out of another tool that says it's a fail, we're going to go look at the bus traces from the Lecroy tool and do an independent assessment from that, whether or not a device actually is passing or failing or not, because we kind of feel that that is giving us kind of the most direct answer about what's happening on the wire on the bus. So if there happens to be a conflict between the answers those tools provide, that's the procedure that we're going to follow. So here's a table just describing the test support between these different tools. And you'll see pretty quickly that on the Teledynelecroy side, plain and simple, more of the tests are supported. And on the PC edition tool, because of the limitations of it just being essentially using a test driver to do the test and not having the same kind of traffic generation capability as a hardware generator like LaCroix, we just can't implement some of the tests. So you'll see in that middle column there, we've got some yellow dots for some of the conformance tests where we haven't been able to implement all of them using that tool. And then you'll see they're green on the right under Teledynelecroy. And that's simply, again, due to the differences in capabilities of these tools. You'll notice specifically Group 6, the controller architecture tests. None of those tests have been able to have been implemented on the PC edition tool, but we've done 3 out of 4 of them on the Teledynelecroy tool. Only test 6.1 is not implemented on the Teledynelecroy tool. And so that test 6.1, it's a defined test, but again, it's not a supported test. We don't have any tools to do it, so it doesn't have any effect on integrators list qualification. And there's a note to that effect in the test suite if you were to go and look at that document. And again, we had talked earlier about which tests are mandatory and which tests are optional. This table helps us see on the conformance side which tests are mandatory and which are optional. In groups 1 and 5, all of the tests are mandatory. In group 2, there's one optional test, this data set management test. So for clients that are implementing thin provisioning, if you implement that, this test may become mandatory if you implement that option. If not, then it remains a not applicable test. Same for tests 3.1 and 3.2, 4.6, and 6.4. And that test 6.4 is an important one. That's one that's been added since the 1.1 version of the NVMe test program. So that's a test that's new for this 1.1b version. That test 6.4 is for subsystem reset. So there's a flag that can be set in the device capabilities table to indicate whether or not that's set. We check that bit, and if it's set, we perform the test. If it's not set, the test is just not applicable. So this is a nice resource for knowing which tests are mandatory and which tests are optional. So that was a nice walkthrough of the testing and what actually is going to be performed at the event, what tools we're going to use, what's mandatory, what's not mandatory. I'm going to move now a little bit into Plugfest Logistics and what's actually going to happen during the event, how to make sure you're all registered for the event, and so forth. So as I mentioned before, registration for the event is open to UNH IOL members. I've got a screen here of the registration page, a link to the registration page, and also a link to the membership page. So you'll want to have those two things squared away first to make sure that you can attend the event. Now, one thing, sometimes we get questions about this, who should attend the event? Our answer, anybody that's developing or deploying NVMe products, any companies that are going to be supporting NVMe SSDs in their server systems. And sometimes we get a question, well, I've got a very early prototype product, is it all right to bring it to the event? And kind of where we draw the line on this is if a product is functional, an SSD is functional to the point that when you plug it into a system, plug it into a host platform, it can be identified as a storage device. If it's functional to that point, you can expect that it'll be fine to use at the event. If it's not at that point yet, and there's still development going on, there might be limited value in bringing that to the Plugfest. But if it's at the point where you can plug it into a Windows system or a Linux system and actually see it as a disk drive and perform reads and writes to it, you'll probably get good value out of coming to an event like this. If you don't have a functional product, or you don't have a product at all, there's probably limited value in coming and attending the event, because the event is going to be really focused on performing testing and performing testing on products. There's not a lot of room for observers or anything like that. So it's really focused on folks that have products that are at some functional stage. Now, at the event, that big room, that picture that I showed you before of our big Plugfest room, we're going to have a bunch of different conformance stations set up. We're going to have a station for the Teledynelecroy tool. We're going to have a station for the PC edition tool. And we're going to have a bunch of Interop stations set up with various host platforms and operating systems. And each SSD product that's at the event is going to be cycled through each one of those test stations. It's going to have the conformance tests performed on both the LaCroix and PC edition tools, and it's going to have Interop testing performed on each of those systems that I showed you earlier in that table of which systems we're going to have up at the event. Now, as I said, some of those stations aren't required for the integrators list, specifically those boot and hot plug FYI stations on the Interop side. And then also, we're going to have 5 systems set up for the write, read, and verify test, but you only have to pass with 4 of them. We're going to have some other FYI tests that are there kind of as a value add for the event. We're going to be doing some PCIe electrical testing. This, again, is probably only interesting to products that are implementing SFF8639. Again, this is not a required test. We're just trying to explore what kind of testing is necessary for this newer form factor. So again, these are FYI. This one is not quite as solid about if it will be required in the future. So I'll make a distinction between this kind of FYI test and the boot and hot plug tests. Those boot and hot plug tests are FYI for now, but are definitely going to be required at our next Plugfest. This one is FYI now, and I can't say if that's going to be required at some point in the future. But definitely an opportunity to get some good information about the electrical characteristics of your device. So that's going to be something that's available. There may also be other companies attending, other test companies that have protocol test tools. And maybe trying to perform some of their own protocol testing that they've defined for their tool. And they're interested in attending this event, as an opportunity to test against multiple SSDs and kind of try out their software and their hardware. Those test stations also would be considered FYI. And again, we have these companies come in because, of course, the Plugfest event, we do want to get products on the integrators list. But again, this is a community event. We're trying to improve the entire NVMe ecosystem. And so for other test companies that are coming in with protocol tools, we want to offer that opportunity to them as well to get to try their stuff out with a variety of different SSDs. So you may see some of those other protocol test stations set up, but they're simply FYI tests. Once again, the hot plug and boot tests, those are going to be FYI at this event, but required at the next event. Now, the reporting. Now, the reporting is really important because the reports that we create coming out of this event, those are really the input documents for qualifying a device for the NVMe integrators list. So making sure that we collect all the data properly and correctly so that we can create those reports is very important. Now, the conformance test data is going to be collected by UNH ILO staff. We'll be performing those tests. We're going to be saving the bus traces in the case of the Teledynelecroy tool and the logs that tool creates, as well as the logs from the PC edition tool. And we'll use that in determining the final pass-fail determination for each device. And we'll use that to create the conformance test report. Same thing on the Interop side. We'll be running Interop tests in parallel on all those systems, and we'll collect the logs from those Interop tests that are created by VDBench. So actually, if you download the VDBench tool and those parameter files, you can see exactly what that log file is going to be that we're going to be creating. And VDBench actually creates an error log, and essentially that's going to be the most important one for this event. We're going to look in that error log and see if everything completed without error, okay, this test passed. If there's anything else there, we'd have to go back and examine it and see what the issue was. So here's a look at what our reports are actually going to look like. Cover page there for our conformance test report, and it's going to outline exactly what happened in each test and why we made a pass or fail determination. If a test is all passing, or passes all the applicable tests, all the ones that apply to that device depending on the features it supports, that report can be used to list a product on the NVMe integrators list. These reports also, they become your property. You can use these reports as you see fit in sharing with your customers and partners to demonstrate conformance and interoperability even beyond the information that's contained on the integrators list. So let's get a little bit more into the process for actually listing these products. I've got a link here for the integrators list policy document. So you follow that link and you'll actually see the document that describes in detail, and more detail than I can get into on the call today, what kind of information is contained in the integrators list, what operating systems must be tested against, how many operating systems need to be tested against, and things like that. That's all contained in that policy document. So the things that I've shared with you today are all drawn from that policy document. And one of the important things in that document is that it tells you quite explicitly that in order to list a product on the NVMe integrators list, you must have a test report for it. And so this Plugfest is an opportunity to get one of those test reports. If you have an all-passing report, you can then send a message directly to UNH-IOL that you would like to list a product based on that all-passing report. So you can send that directly to nvmelab@iol.unh.edu. Here's the list of information that would be included in the integrators list listing, and again, this is also defined in that policy document. So nothing too surprising here. Obviously, product type, the name, the company, the manufacturer name, model name, the operating system and driver, if it happens to be a host, which operating system and driver was used to perform the testing, the firmware revision if it's an SSD, the Interop program revision. Now everything that we do at this Plugfest will be for Interop program revision 1.1b, but again, when you go to that integrators listing page, you'll see some of the older revisions of the program and the products were listed for those. The date of listing, and then the further information is just an opportunity if you wanted to link to the data sheet or provide some kind of contact for people to get more information about that product, you can do that there. So this is the information that actually ultimately gets put up onto that NVMe integrators list. Now, one question that we get a fair amount is, well, what if I have a product that's very similar? Do I have to test it again? Things like that. And so in that policy document, you'll see we have a policy about listing by similarity. And essentially, if a product has differences that don't affect NVMe operation, they can be listed by similarity. You don't need to retest them. So examples of those changes might be form factor or storage capacity. So if you've got a drive, you've got a 500 gig version, you've got a terabyte version, but other than that, they're identical. There's no need to retest those products. If they do have different NVMe features, though, for example, maybe you have one device that supports a subsystem controller reset, another firmware version that does not support that feature. That's a feature change that affects NVMe operation. So if you had different features supported on two different products, those are things that could not be listed similarly. You would have to, in fact, test each of them separately. So you can, again, refer to the policy for a little bit more information about that. So finally, for testing that's going to occur after the Plugfest, if people miss the Plugfest, your product's not ready, UNH-IOL's lab is going to stay open throughout the year. We're going to continue to test products according to the testing and following the same testing that we're introducing at this Plugfest. And even if the testing doesn't occur at the Plugfest, it occurs here at UNH-IOL, those products that pass are still eligible to be included on the NVMe integrators list. And if you do have requests for testing and you're a member of the UNH-IOL NVMe Consortium, you can use this link here to request and schedule testing. So one thing I just want to revisit really quickly, I talked a lot about the requirements for this particular Plugfest, number 3, but I don't want people to forget the requirements that are coming in the future. So specifically, those Interop tests, we're going to increase the number of systems that we test with from 4 out of 5 to 5 out of 6. That boot test is going to become mandatory, and that hot plug test is going to become mandatory at the next Plugfest. So if there's a chance that you're not able to attend this Plugfest, be aware that the requirements of the future Plugfest we've already determined those are going to be a little bit higher. So again, just a recap of the benefits we have at the UNH-IOL NVMe Consortium: access to the Plugfest. I hope a lot of you are able to attend this upcoming event. Access to our test tools, so you can mimic the testing that we do in our lab and the testing that we do at the Plugfest. You can mimic that and replicate that in your own lab. The ability to list products on the NVMe integrators list. The ability to put products in our NVMe Interoperability Test bed, make that available for kind of an ongoing Plugfest at UNH-IOL. And then finally, support for the open source tools that we've put out there and continue to maintain for the benefit of the entire NVMe community. And just a review of our presentation today. Remember, this whole program is focused on the integrators list and trying to showcase those products that have demonstrated conformance and interoperability. The test tools that I've talked about today, you can obtain those from UNH-IOL. Obviously, the VD Bench tool is an open source tool. You can just get that right off the web. And this Plugfest is the first opportunity to test products according to these 1.1b requirements. After that, after the Plugfest, UNH-IOL will continue to test according to those 1.1b requirements. So even if you're unable to attend the Plugfest, you can still get testing done and get a product on the integrators list. A couple resources here. These have been linked to throughout the presentation, but I thought it would be handy to have them all in one place. The UNH-IOL membership form, the Plugfest registration form for registering yourself and your product for the event, and then also the Interop test suite, Conformance Test suite. Those are on the same page, that third bullet there. And then finally, the integrators list policy document, if you want to see the details about the requirements for listing. They're all contained in that policy document, so you can use this as to do some further research about this. So thank you, everyone, for listening. I hope it was informative. And of course, now we can open it up to questions. I imagine there's some that have piled up in the chat. So